Thank you. I'm calling this talk, Ian and Technology, the Time of His Life. Ian was very keen to make this a joyous occasion, and was very clear about my role in doing that, helping that happen. I'm here to share with you some stories of Ian during the time he worked for Texas Instruments, otherwise known as TI for short, in Bedford. In the 15 years or so up until when TI finally pulled out in 1994, at that point Ian then went on to work for Motorola in Aylesbury, heading up their applications team. So I first came across Ian when I was a lowly engineer back in 1978, 79. It's worth explaining, but back then Texas Instruments was a massive employer in Bedford. It was the second biggest employer at one time, with over 3,000 employees. It was a huge place. And it was a major technology centre for TI, and their core business was increasingly the design, the application and manufacture of silicon chips, things that changed the world. I was part of a chip design group, and we shared a lab space and an office with the applications team, of which Ian was a member. The role of an application engineer was to help customers apply the new TI chips to do new and wonderful things. Back then, there were projects like teletext, TV remote controls, smoke detectors were mysterious new devices, and even toys were starting to talk. And our chips were doing all this sort of thing. And back then, you probably can remember things like CFAX. The job of the applications engineer was to help the customers with all this stuff. And, well, I first noticed Ian. Well, you couldn't really not notice him. Let's just say he had a voice which travelled very well across the lab. And his turn of phrase was particularly colourful, and his style of banter was so much more loud and jocular than the more conservative design types that I was working amongst. And so the junior engineer like me was pretty much chained to my desk, whereas these apps guys, as we call them, were out and about, pretending to visit customers and having a lot more fun, it seemed, and playing with all these cool new applications. It's really hard to describe the ecstasy of, back then seeing a CFAX page on a television. I mean, it's sad, really, but we thought it was great fun. And the thing about Ian, he'd come back from a customer with vivid, entertaining stories of what had gone on. A lot of it, I'm sure, was embellished, but it was seriously entertaining. And just one time I remember that it was particularly funny. There was a lighting project at the local brewery, Charles Wells in Bedford, where a lighting control system had been designed in as a prototype. I think the system may have even been demoed on Tomorrow's World on TV. Instead of costly lengths of mains switching cable and unhygienic light switches, you had these little panels and tiny signal wires tracking back to some microprocessor that was supposed to control all this stuff. Well, Ian's story of how all this worked in practice, when it was first switched on, it just had us in stitches. Lights coming on and off at random, windowless parts of the brewery suddenly plunged into darkness, and the inevitable references of things which should be easy to organise in a brewery. Part of Ian's role involved doing duty on the applications hotline service where customers would ring in. The most common questions were all around whether or not a specific Texas chip could be used as a plug-in replacement for another supplier's version of the same functionality, to which Ian would enjoy responding, well, try plugging it in and see what happens. And this actually predates the very common phrase today, try turning it off and on again. I mean, that was Ian. But, I should add, on a serious note, that Ian's ability to grasp actually what customers were trying to achieve and to help them technically was second to none. But that's all rather boring, so I won't dwell on that. But I think behind Ian's or his ability to do this was an amazingly inquiring mind. He was always trying to understand what lay behind things. What made things tick? He was so inquisitive. And here's an example of just how inquisitive he was. Back in the day, Bedford was home to a very upmarket gentleman's outfitters in the centre of Bedford, in the prestigious shopping arcade off the high street, a real hub in the centre of this prosperous town. Clayton's, it was called. And you had personalised service helping you to find what you were looking for. Well, Ian confessed to me how he'd been in there one particular day and was about to try on a pair of trousers. Well, of course, Clayton's had the most well-appointed dressing rooms you could imagine. I can remember them. Sheer luxury, beautiful upholstered Chippendale chair to put your clothes on. And the doors to these changing rooms, they kind of closed with a lovely, solid clunk. None of this sort of flapping curtain with gaps for people to peer through, total privacy. So there he is, in one of these rooms, and he's removed his trousers, just before trying on the new pair, he suddenly spotted some catches on a panel at the side of this, inside this changing room, and curiosity got the better of him, and sure enough, Ian then opens this panel, and the whole thing drops away, revealing Ian in all his glory, standing in the shop window to the amazement of all the passers-by. And he'd become the new undressed feature of the window dressing. So there obviously followed a lot of fumbling and attempts to pick up and place back this wall to much to the enjoyment of everyone passing by. So anyway, another story that no relation, a chap called Mr. Clayton, Mark Clayton, no relation to these outfitters. He reminded me of another story about Ian's inquisitiveness. So there's many stories like this, but this is a particularly good one. So this is what was written by Mark Clayton. We had over a week in Tokyo, and had some great fun exploring Japanese culture. Right from the start, when Ian discovered, well, the fun started even on the plane, because Ian discovered he was seated on the plane next to Peter Dowdeswell, who holds many drinking and eating world records. We knew from that point on it would be a fun trip. We joined in as part of his entourage, and when we went through the arrivals area at Tokyo Airport, there was an entire TV crew waiting for us, complete with geisha girls laden with flowers. Probably the most memorable moment was when we came back to our hotel, the New Otani, after a night out. We discovered in the hotel lobby area, in the gents' toilets, the most incredible high-tech WC imaginable. The Japanese pioneered these very intelligent toilets that were capable of analysing whatever came out of you and doing a lot more besides. It had all sorts of bells and whistles, pipes and tubes, and we were pressing everything merrily and rolling around laughing at such an invention. Although these things are now quite common in Asian hotels, it was beyond belief for our little Bedford trio back in the late 80s. I think by the time we finally vacated the men's toilets, the entire area was well and truly flooded. Mark now lives in Germany, so couldn't be here today, but sends his best wishes. Another good friend, Tim Summers, reminded me of a time when he saw Ian storming into the smoking room, brandishing a message printout, apparently from the TI head of European marketing. And he was being very rude about Ian's product strategy. Ian smoked 2 cigarettes in quick succession whilst seeking Tim's feedback on how he was going to rebut the ridiculous assault on his product strategy. Ian was physically fuming in more ways than one when he left the smoking room, charged to pen the most robust response that he could do. And he sent it to the unsuspecting head of European marketing, only to learn that the original message was an early example of fake news. And I must admit to being guilty here of hacking the system to make the fake message look as genuine as possible. A trick I learnt off Frank at the back there, I should add, who did it to me a few years earlier. But anyway, that's how things always were with Ian. Passionate about his work, seriously hard work, interspersed with a lot of frivolity like that. Occasions like the time he peppered every object in my office with post-it notes. I mean, he must have spent all evening the night before doing it. When it's my office, everywhere there were post-it notes with detailed critique, comments, insightful things about every object in the office, or, doodles and scribble notes. He totally just mocked and ridiculed just my entire purpose in life at TI. Great fun, all in good humour. Ian also assumed the mantle of Guy Fawkes when he became interested in homemade fireworks. And after copious research and meeting the world-famous Reverend Lancaster from Kimbolton, this resulted in him making increasingly powerful rockets, which culminated in an enormous airborne explosion one evening in his Bedford town garden. I think the police were alerted, and a piece appeared in the Beds on Sunday newspaper, titled "Mysterious Explosions Heard All Over Bedford." On another occasion, after that, Frank, who's here today, and we accompanied him out to a field deep in the North Bedfordshire countryside, where a kindly farmer had given us permission to fire 2 more of Ian's creations. The first shot off beyond sight, but the second, it didn't appear to light. And after some minutes, Ian gingerly approached it, and with his nose almost touching the barrel of the rocket, suddenly Ian let out a loud expletive as whoosh. The reluctant missile belatedly thrust itself skyward. But unlike the first one, this one, after starting off in a vertical direction, suddenly tilted and then made an enormous downward dive into some bales of straw nearby, and we all had to run over and splash out, stamp out the flames, while the farmer was luckily didn't quite see the worst of this. It was all over by the time he got to us. So great fun. Also, from those days, actually going back to the days when he was application support, another friend, Lou Kourra, writes, sent in this story. He says, "This anecdote is about an unintended fundraising that Ian and I concocted when we were at TI in the autumn of the winter, with the winter months approaching. To make mornings more exciting in the department, we started a sweepstake to select a date when the manager of the department would come in wearing his camel-coloured cashmere overcoat. It was intended just for colleagues in the department, but as word spread, it soon attracted punters from all over the building who rushed down to select a date, and each day to see whether they'd been successful. And the money started to mount up. Well, as you can imagine, the excitement each morning as your selected date had arrived, only to be dashed by disappointment, a click of the fingers, a swing of the arm, and a decision to try again and select another date. The excitement would reach its peak when the temperatures were low and there'd been an overnight frost, but alas, the fashion statement did not make an appearance. In the end, as spring came, Ian and I decided we should donate the money to a hospice, which we duly did. I recall the amount collected was about £35, and this is some 30 years ago. We received a letter from the hospice thanking us for this innovative approach to fundraising and urged us to continue next winter. The letter was put on the company notice board to notify all of those who took part in this good deed, including the main subject, who will remain nameless. We worked hard, but we never forgot to have a bit of fun on the way. That's how I'll always fondly remember Ian. So Lou added an afterthought that the person who helped us locate the suitable charity was Penny, who's the beloved late wife of Frank, who's here today. So another happy memory of Ian, who brought so much fun into so many people's lives. And that era of his life at TI was a time when Ian really was on top form, working hard but having so much fun along the way. Ian's love of technology never left him, and from those TI days onwards, Ian's incisive views on what technologies would or wouldn't take off and change the world were always spookily accurate, grounded in thoughtful investigations, where the internet became so useful to him in the later years when he was more housebound. I'd like to end on another story which started all those years ago, back in the 80s, when Ian was driving up to Wolfson Microelectronics in Edinburgh to see the head of marketing, John McPate. By the way, John McPate has repeatedly told me that the company Wolfson would never have grown into the success that it did had it not been for Ian's persistence in pushing TI to collaborate with them back in the 80s. Anyway, there was Ian driving from Bedford to Edinburgh, and he was up somewhere near Nottingham on his way to see Wolfson in Edinburgh. So this is the early 90s, and Ian had swankily bragged about having a new mobile phone with him. So that was it. I had to ring him, and I rang him, and I put on my best Scottish accent, and I said, "Hey, it's John. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cancel the meeting." Ian fell for this, and rather annoyed, turned round, headed back south. Well, I had intended to phone straight back and confess to my jape, but alas, the phone system was pretty intermittent even then. And by the time I got through, he'd driven over an hour in the wrong direction, and he was not pleased. And I think it took a bit of calming down when I next saw him. But time went by, all the time's gone by, and the reason I saved that story is that on the 30th of June this year, I had the good fortune to see Ian for a couple of hours in hospital. And despite his condition, we were able to chat quite a bit and even share a few jokes. And I said farewell about 3 p.m, said see you again soon, headed home towards Bedford. Never before have I known the A303 to flow so smoothly. I mean, I even passed an upside-down car in the ditch and emergency services at Stonehenge and didn't drop below 60. I mean, it was so, the traffic was just, I got so far away when finally the phone rang, and I was almost at Oxford, with the news that Ian had died. And I then had to turn round and drive all the way back that day. And it was like Ian had got his own back for what I did to him in 1992. So it was kind of enjoyable justice, I think. So thank you, Ian, and from all your friends from that TI era. It was a very good time in your life. I think you were having the time of your life. Working with you meant that I certainly was too.